Thank you for having me. Actually, Christine didn't invite me. Ola did. For those who knew him, he was very persistent.
I knew him
You know, well,
all my life.
yeah. Well, I went to school with his brother Nate.
Know him too.
Yeah, and so we'll talk about that
Mr.
later.
Jewish too.
But he was again responsible for bringing this schedule today, and it's just sad that he's not here. But I think he's looking down.
Yes, it is.
This all started a number of years ago by someone who we have here. You can go ahead, and that's Curtis Crow. Curtis is a member of our Historical Society, a longtime Hightstown resident, and he did a human interest story in what was then called the Hightstown Gazette on George Sumry, who's Ola's father. His father, you can go ahead a little bit. As I just mentioned, Nate was in my class in Hightstown, and I didn't really know his older brother, George Ola, but I knew the family well because they lived right around the corner from us. And of course, we were in classes together and played sports together. But Curtis saw Mr. Sumry around town a lot. He was very distinctive. He had a, you can forward one. He did a lot of gardening. He did gardening for people as well as for himself, and we'll see a couple of pictures of that. He had come to Hightstown in what's referred to as the Great Northern Migration. He was brought up in Alabama. He had many brothers and sisters, and of course things were not easy down in Alabama back in the early 1900s. So he and his brother, I think George was only 13 at the time, decided to move out of Alabama and go look for work. So they went to a couple other locations in down south, but then he started to, with his brother, come north with migrant farmers and to do labor on the migrant in the migrant camps on the farms in our area. That was very, very popular back then. George, as he had told Curtis, who did an absolutely fantastic job of the interview, said he was always looking to where he wanted to settle because he knew he didn't want to stay in Alabama. And many summers he would come into the Hightstown, East Windsor area, and like then World War II came, and he got drafted. And after getting out of the service, he decided that he wanted to come back to the Hightstown, East Windsor area. So assuming that he didn't spend all his money that he made in the Army, he had enough money to buy a house, which was very forward thinking, very responsible, et cetera. And he bought a house on, for those that are from that area, on Airport Road, just off of Route 33. There was no other houses there at the time. It was at the junction. There was a few houses, but not that many, but it was at the junction that we call the Union Transport Railroad, which was the Hightstown to Pemberton Railroad, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And with his wife, they opened a little store in the front of the house, which served the migrant workers. So he became permanent, but that neighborhood stayed populated in the summers, fall and spring as well, with migrant workers who, of course, needed to buy groceries. And so the Sumrys, were their grocery store. Father George ended up being pretty much of a mentor to a lot of those migrants, because as you can imagine, when you talk about young males who were migrant workers on payday, they could get a little rowdy. And so George was somewhat of a authority figure in that area, in that neighborhood, which we call West Airport Road. the farming that was done at that time, you can leave it there for a second.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's George. Most of the farming that was done in the early 1900s in this area were produce and potatoes. Potatoes, before there was a heavy mechanization, required a lot of labor. And that's also why a lot of farmers back then had 10, 11, or 12 kids, because that was the cheapest type of labor. You can go to the next one. He was considered to be an expert horticulturist, right, Curtis? I mean, he grew everything from seed and knew how to various things that he grew. This happens to be a fig tree. And he also, which is unusual, the fig tree up north, but grew tobacco and peanuts and some other unusual crops and flowers. He loved flowers.
Yes.
And he worked for many years at Braun's Nursery, greenhouses, which was in Hightstown. And then he seemed to never have idle moments because he also landscaped for people and cut grass, as well as running the store. He was very well respected, as was his wife and his family. All four of his children ended up going to college. And actually, I forgot to mention that his actual town that he was born in was Phoenix City, Alabama. And he still has relatives down there. And I know the Sunbury family has gone back for different reunions. He also worked on the railroad because, as I mentioned, there was a railroad, a short railroad that went from Hightstown to Pemberton. So it was a dead end railroad. It wasn't a through line at the time. So not wanting too much idle time and being the responsible man that he was, he worked on the railroad as need be. Yeah, I don't know when he slept.
Oh, no. Just let me know.
Yeah. You go. So Haula and I hooked up because I republished Curtis's story that he'd written in 1997, and Haula somehow saw it and called me. I hadn't seen him for 50 some years, I don't think, although I had seen Nate and talked to Nate occasionally over the years. And he says, let's have lunch. So I met him and we had lunch and exchanged a lot of stories first. And then we both decided that there really was nothing in our area to memorialize the contributions of the African-American families to agriculture and to commerce. So of course he says, Cappy, with your position in Historical Society, why don't you do something about that? Sound familiar? So I talked to our society and we agreed that it was a very worthwhile project. And so we started to work on it. I do a lot of research on my own, et cetera, before I present it to other people. And it just so happened right across the street from the Sunbury store on Airport Road is 3 ideal spots for some type of little park with memorial and telling the story of the migrants, the Sunbury family and the migrants and the other families that ended up settling in our town. Nice thing is all 3 of them are publicly owned. And which means you don't have to waste a lot of money buying land. So I found all those 3 locations, have informally presented them to the township, and assuming everything else works out, they're on board, you know, as these being likely locations. You can go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
As good luck would have it, this was a year before when Will and I got together and started talking about it, spent like 6-8 months putting some ideas together. And then in 2020, February 2020, it was reported that East Windsor Township received essentially a $500,000 grant to change that old railroad bed to a trail, rails to trails. For those that are familiar where you're from, the railroad goes right through Hornerstown, crosses 539 at Hornerstown, and it's about 24 and a half miles from Pemberton to Hightstown. And the rails to trails exists there almost all the way to Hightstown and stops at Old York Road, which is 539, pretty much where Monmouth County, Mercer County meet. So this grant will pay for the last two and a half to 3 miles from that point over to a place that's called, it's a winery, Working Dog Winery. And then across the turnpike and through Centex Development, we call it, and it terminates at Airport Road, right across essentially from the Sunbury's store. We all know rails to trails is becoming very popular, and it just would be a great location, also easily accessible to vehicles and adequate room for parking. God, I can't.
It's okay. We're all covered. We're all covered. You have good business, so if you need to, we got it.
Yeah, the besides the families like the Sunbury family that came up from Alabama, a lot of the migrant workers also came from the West Indies, but also the Low Country, off of Georgia and South Carolina. And so our hope is to be able to get other stories of those in our area that ended up coming as migrants, but then staying in our community. In the summertime, a full year round population of where the Sunburys lived was about 50 total people, including the children. But in the summertime, it could get up to 200-300 people. You know, for the stores, do you remember?
Used to be more than that.
Yeah, more than that. Yeah. So we, there was also a couple of places, everything wasn't nirvana, because there were a few places they called juke joints.
Yep.
Yep. Which are essentially where the males would let off some steam, you know, after getting their paycheck. Ola also shared with me the story of when there was a need for assistance other than his father, you know, to take care of those that were unruly. The police would come, and one of the first, if not, I think he was actually the first African-American state trooper, was stationed in the barracks in Hightstown, which was only about a mile and a half away. And
He's still alive, by the way, Paul McLemore.
and he's an attorney. He became an attorney. And is he still alive?
Yeah, I spoke with him a couple months ago.
Oh, really? The family was so impressed with that. Aula, his brother Nate, and Margaret and Marie, because they'd never seen, you know, someone who looked like them in a police uniform, let alone a state police uniform. So those locations, I'll show you, you can go ahead.
Yeah, it's just slow.
That's all right.
That's good. Yeah. Hello. Technology.
Yeah.
Good catch up. There you go.
Okay, so I got ahead of myself as far as the locations, but Route 33 is right here. For those familiar with the area, Speedway Bicycle Shop is right there, which is again at the terminus. And you can almost see the railroad line, you know, as it still cuts through the trees. And there's athletic fields for PAL up in this area. And this is actually one of the spots that is very large for adequate parking if there's trouble putting it exactly right there at the terminus. Okay, you got it. this was some restore.
Mhm.
Still, the house is still there.
Yep.
This is the Zion Pentecostal Church. And I didn't know, there's a lot of things I don't know, but I didn't know that, I knew they were both, Evelyn and George were both church-going people, but I didn't know they went to two different churches. Did you know that?
I just found out recently.
So George's father went to this Pentecostal church, and
No, his mom
his mom went there, then
did. She was a preacher there.
there, okay.
And her dad was a deacon at the Baptist church.
At the Baptist church downtown.
Yeah.
So that church is still there. I've been trying to find who has the records of that church. There's a Pentecostal church up in that Montclair area that I reached out to, but I haven't heard back. But hopefully someone has some of those old records.
How old is that church? Do you know when it was built?
No, I don't. My guess is back at the 30s, not way before that, but at best the 30s, probably around the same time that that George built the house.
The service for George was in that church too, as I recall.
Oh,
This area was actually had referred to in a couple different ways. And before the UT was actually built, the first railroad in New Jersey that carried passengers between two cities was the Camden and Amboy Railroad. And it went from Amboy to Camden. Initially, it stopped in Bordentown before it was completed all the way to Camden. But at the end of this street is where the Camden and Amboy went through, and the UT came into a junction when it was built. But that area is referred to as the woodsheds, but also Excelsior Swamp. So after the UT came in the 1860s, there were some subdivisions and houses built there, but also then some very poor housing.
Shotgun houses.
Yeah, which is where the migrants stayed, when they came through. That's just the Hightstown Gazette article from 1866 announcing the opening of the UT. Okay, you can go on.
mhm.
This is a little map of the UT from Hightstown to Pemberton. It eventually then had an extension that went into Camden. But for those, even though this is a small map, it's a large area, but it just went right through a very, very significant agricultural area. The UT was actually ridden by a number of people, students, to come to high school. That's how important the railroad was. And but also in this whole area, there was something called Marl. Marlton was named after Marl. So for decades and decades and decades, they excavated Marl and put it on the train and would take it to farms that needed a little more nutrients, because Marl was loaded with nutrients. Ironically, nowadays, they bring in fertilizer, to put on the same fields that they've taken all this Marl off of. You can go ahead first.
Mhm.
This is a better picture of the map, Hightstown, all the way through, and New Egypt, Cookstown, as I said, what we were talking about before, of Fenimore, being right here, which is now called the Cream Ridge Station. But the rails to trails will go all the way into Hightstown. Okay. So also, I think it's very important to have people like pictures. You can tell a story, you write it down, but people love pictures. There's, unfortunately, there's not a load of pictures, around from that era, but I was able to find some, and we're looking for more. because we'd like to put as many up as possible with the stories. Of course, nowadays you can have an oral story as well as the pictures, so somebody can just pull out their cell phone, and punch in a number and hear the story as well as having to read it. But this is, they're doing potatoes here, a cultivator. Go ahead. And then there was even horses that were still being used. You see here in some of those farms, even though there was already motorized vehicles and rubberized tires, some still use the metal wheels and the horses. And this is the other time of year where there's harvesting apples. So there are more migrants that would come up with the apples. Heights down East Windsor area was very large amount of peach orchards and apple orchards. Everybody in the family worked. When there were those who came up with family. So you can go ahead, Kristen. And everybody worked together. And this happens to be the Molly Pitcher Potato Farm, which is out between Hightstown and Freehold, and of course Molly Pitcher being famous from the Battle of Monmouth. I think what's interesting here in those other pictures is you saw the African Americans were also operating the equipment. So they weren't just laborers; they became skilled workers and even operating the equipment. We talked about Ola, Nate, how inclusive the community was. And back in these are pictures from the early 1900s. The schools were always integrated. There was one time in the academy in the 1860s had hired a new principal, and he wanted to eliminate the African-American children from the class. Well, he was gone. Trustees got rid of him in a year. So the history pretty much shows that there was always integration there were no separate schools. Now, there were some private academies. So if there's some families that didn't like that, then they put their kids in private academies. So we have some pictures in 1913, 1917, and you'll see, the different colors that we have, and which is great of our history. Go ahead. The only thing that I always found funny is these pictures of school kids was they seemed as stoic as their parents. Nobody seemed to be laughing or joking with each other. This is where the actual UT and the Camden Amboy met at the place. The woodsheds and Excelsior Swamp was right next to it. You can go ahead and see. And this was a building of it was then called Highway 7, which was one of the first cement roads in the state, which is now we know is Route 33. And of course, there was laborers as well as engineers, et cetera, that were building this in 1920s, which also goes right through, right next to the place that we're talking about. For those familiar with town, that's the Baptist Church, Steve.
Oh, that's the one, the dad.
Yeah, the big church. Yeah. So Airport Road. Where did Airport Road come from? Well, there was actually an airport there. And this is a picture of one of the first deliveries of airmail, which came to Airport Road, which was very close to the Sunbury store. So we think it's very important too to tell not just the story about the Sunburys and the contributions of the African Americans, et cetera, but also the society and what they lived with there, the whole community. There was also a racetrack, which kept me awake on Friday nights.
A lot of noise.
Because I could walk to there or actually see it. And actually, it was very popular and well-known in the tri-state area for many, many years. See, it's another picture, same thing. All right, so in looking at, I've been lucky enough to drive around. Lots of places I drive as much as I can. It's much to my wife's disappointment, right? And I always try to take the road less traveled by, which is where you'll find a lot of interesting signs. And so over the years, I've watched and seen different signs to do these type of memorials and what seems to look good, what seems to last, and what doesn't last. So I came up with, okay, you can have pavilion type of signs, which I'll show you pictures of, plaque stanchions, types of signs, etc., and the negatives and positives of each, which I had talked to Ola about, while we were putting this together. This is a pavilion type of sign, which is up in the Adirondacks, by the way, and it has its advantages, covering from weather, etc. It's not overly expensive to build, and you have many faces of boards that you can actually put many different types of illustrations on and switch them out, over time. Mention signs you've seen, and they are typically on metal stanchions and have plastic or a plastic type material, that's placed on top of it.
I had a question.
Yes.
Catherine Dennis, who published the Heights Center, he said, always told me that Yvonne Drive off Airport Road is correctly named Ivano Drive, but East Windsor had it wrong.
Oh, really? Nate, do you know that, whether Avon Drive was actually Ivano Drive? Off Airport Road?
Airport Road was a pretty complex area. There was the main area, the main street was Airport Road. But there was like an Evans Drive, which was, we used to refer to it as going around the corner. And there were a number of side streets that were like almost branches of Airport Road. And you had settlements and families who lived back there, like the Screws family, the Moore family. There was a church there. In fact, we were members of that church. My sister Marie probably,
Yes.
because I wasn't the best Sunday school student. And Iola was always a good Sunday school student, and my late sister, Pastor Margaret Sunbury joined. She was excellent, but my mother was involved in the Pentecostal church there. But the Evans Drive, there were a number of 3 or 4 little side streets that were off Airport Road where other families lived.
I see a Screws is here, Brian.
Yep. Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Brian Screws. My grandfather, John Lee Screws, was one of the early settlers down there.
Yeah.
He also came from Phoenix City, Alabama, by way of Eufaula. And if there's any research to be done, I'm pretty sure my family would be happy to participate as well. My father, Gene Screws, or Willie Screws, still lives in East Windsor. We still own the property back there off of Eli, I think it's Eli Terrace. And I take my kids back there often and just tell them the stories about my grandfather, which would be their great grandfather, and just the sacrifices that were made in order for our family to achieve and get to the levels, the levels that we've been able to get to. And I'm happy that Nate keeps us, looped in the process and hopeful that we can participate in anything else moving forward.
I'm going to take you up on it, Brian.
Bob Craig? I'm
Yes.
sorry.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to thank Cappy for this presentation. I learned a lot. And I wanted to say a shout out to Nate. Hello. I remember you from the Heightstown High track team many years ago. And my brother Richard also says hello. I also wanted to say there's another connection between East Windsor and Trenton in the African American community. And the very first African-American leader in Trenton came from East Windsor, and very few people know about this story. And his name was Samson Peters, and he was a founder of the first Black church in Trenton and an organization that was kind of a proto-church before that, the Free African Society. He came from East Windsor, where he had been a slave in his youth and had been manumitted, had been set free in 1802. And he then came to Trenton, where he created a small cooperage business for himself. And he became a local preacher within the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he was a delegate to the early AME conferences, beginning in, I think, 1818, almost at the beginning. And he came from, and he had been part of a household that was one of the early Methodist households in East Windsor. And that's where he became acquainted with Black Harry Hosier, the early Black Methodist minister, preacher, and also with Francis Asbury, the father of American Methodism, who was very well known and was a friend of that family in East Windsor. And so there's this connection also that is part of the East Windsor African American history and legacy.
Thank you for sharing, Bob.
Yes, I would like to add a point of clarification. This is Nate Sumbry. My friend and my mentor, Mr. Russ Ballou, what he was probably suggesting and saying that I was a member of the first Upward Bound program class at Princeton University. And he was one of my great mentors I later went back and taught at ASALH High School, but he was my teacher during that summer Upward Bound program. I later went back and served as the assistant director of that program. I actually graduated not from Princeton University, but the great Rutgers University, and I was part of the first graduating class at Livingston College, which was part of Rutgers University at that time. So I just want to add a point of clarification. And also, I was never a track guy. I was a basketball guy. My best friend to this day, Bobby McKnight, was the great track player and probably one of the best athletes that I knew throughout my high school career, and was just like a brother to me and remains that way. But I just wanted to add a point of clarification just so we're all on the same page.
Yes, if you have a moment, I would like to say something also.
Hello? Yes.
My name is
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Barbara Hallett Saunders. My family originated on the Etcher Road since 1939. I became friends, my family became friends with Mr. Summery years back, and I went to the same church on Airport Road. I remember Mr. Summery, oh, what a man from a child. There wasn't any children that he didn't love. He had a candy store there. And we couldn't wait to get over there to see him during the break of church. Wonderful family, friends of my family, and I will never forget George Summery. I even had a chance to work with him, see him at Meadow Lakes before he retired. He worked on the grounds there. Everybody loved him, and I am so appreciative to be able to sit in, you know, on this Zoom to give him some recognition. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Barbara.
Oh yeah, amen.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming out. We will continue to try to do as many of these. Jocelyn came in, I don't know, she's over there trying to hide now. Jocelyn, very much like Cappy, is doing oral history project based here in Trenton. And so, please give your information to Doc. If you have anybody you think could be part of our ordinance project to tell more of the history of the Great Migration here in Trenton. And I think Cappy, Jocelyn, and Pat are also working together because, as Bob said, the connection between the towns, especially through the railroad, it's a perfect match for this collaborative effort. And also, we hope to see you come back in for more of our work. I think we have coming up for the holidays, Hogmanay. You can come and have something hot to drink and hear some Scottish music and celebrate the day after Christmas. I'll be in Disney though.
Christine, let me have one little trivia
Yes.
thing.
Go ahead, love it.
Hightstown did not have a high school until about 1916, 1917. There were some academies, but those that wanted to go through 12th grade in public school got on the train in Hightstown, went down to Bordentown, changed trains to take up to Trenton High School.
Oh, wow.
My grandfather has a 1916 graduation certificate from Trenton High
Nice.
School, for his last 3 years of high school, because Hightstown, can you imagine doing that every day? And now we can't get the kids out of bed. Any more questions? Well, thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you all of our oldest family that's here honoring us today. Our hearts go out to you. It's a great loss to us as well, but more so to you. And we understand your loss. And thank you for showing up today and blessing us with your part of our oldest history. Thank you. All right, everybody.
Thank you.